going on, guys? Today we're going to talk about the Australian green tree frog and their care. For those of you who've followed my channel for some time now, you may remember that I did actually do a green tree frog care video quite some years ago. And the reason I'm redoing that video is because back then my channel was quite new. I was pretty much new to YouTube, and I kind of feel like I could do a much better job of this video now than what I did back then. So I'm pretty much doing a green tree frog care video 2.0. The green tree frog, also known as the White's tree frog or dumpy green tree frog, is native to the northern and eastern parts of Australia. It's found throughout South Australia, Western Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. Australian green tree frogs are typically found somewhere near fresh water. They can be found in rainforests, wetlands, bushlands, and even around houses in urban areas. Often if you have a pond in your backyard, you might actually be lucky enough to get some of these living around your home. Their diet is mostly made up of insects, but they will consume anything that fits in this mouth of theirs, and it is quite a large mouth. They've been seen eating anything from small lizards to even hatchling snakes, as well as frogs that are smaller than them. The average lifespan of a green tree frog can range from anything from 15 to even 20 years. So keep that in mind should you want one of these little guys as a pet. Saying that, as far as frogs go, they're probably one of the easy ones out there to keep. First thing to think about when you want to have one of these as a pet would be the enclosure and the enclosure size. So ideally you want to get an enclosure that is watertight, so you can have water in the enclosure if you want to go down that road of a paludarium. Now these are a reasonable size frog, as you can see here. This one is still not fully grown. I've seen them double this size, so they get to a decent size. They're pretty chunky frogs, and you need to take that into consideration when buying one of these in an enclosure. For one or maybe two green tree frogs that are about this sort of size, so kind of medium size, you'd be looking at a minimum enclosure size of about 60 centimeters by 45 centimeters wide by 60 centimeters tall. Definitely can go bigger if you'd like to, but that'd be the minimum for these. And they do need enclosure with height because they are climbers. Be sure to get an enclosure that has decent ventilation, as these frogs don't actually like ridiculously high humidity. They do like some air exchange and airflow in their enclosure. So I would recommend an actual reptile enclosure rather than a glass fish tank, because most reptile enclosures have ventilation, especially like on the top. So you can get an enclosure from, say, Exoterra or ZooMed, for example. They'll do quite well. They make lots of enclosures that are tall enough to do green tree frogs in as well. So now you've got your terrarium. What are you going to put in it? Well, for starters, they're a frog. One thing all frogs need is water. Now, green tree frogs aren't an overly aquatic frog, like, for example, a marsh frog. Marsh frogs tend to spend most of their time in the water. Green tree frogs, on the other hand, actually spend most of their time around the water. They almost rarely, if ever, actually go swimming in the water. So you don't necessarily have to go a full aquatic setup for these like you would like a marsh frog, for example, but you do want to give them access to clean water at all times. Now look, there's one of two ways you can go about their enclosure regarding the water in the enclosure. You can do what I've done behind me here and set up kind of a paludarium style setup where the entire bottom of the enclosure is water and there's filtration in that as well. So it's essentially like having a freshwater aquarium in your frog enclosure. Now, bearing in mind, this is a reasonable sized water reservoir for this enclosure for these frogs, which, like I said, they don't really swim. On the rare occasion, usually at night time, I'll catch one or two of them maybe sitting in the water. They'll be kind of on the glass with half of their body under the water. And that's about as far as they go with it. But the water's at least there if they need it. If you don't want to go to that level of extremity, you can just give them a large water bowl of water and they will quite happily sit in that when they want to rehydrate themselves. Make sure you do change it daily though, or at least every couple of days, because frogs absolutely need very clean water. And this is because the way they're designed. Their skin is basically like a sponge. They breathe through their skin, but their skin will absorb anything that touches it and put it straight into their body essentially. And if that water's dirty, if you haven't changed it in a while, if there's organic matter like poop or leaf litter rotting in the water, and it's creating a lot of nitrates, for example, that's going to absorb into your frog's body, could make it very sick. This is also why I'm wearing these gloves. Frogs can also absorb anything out of our skin into theirs. The oils on our skin will also pull moisture from them and dehydrate them. Any chemicals, soaps, colognes, anything you have on your hands can potentially make your frog very sick or even kill them. and that's why I'm wearing these gloves for holding them. Alternatively, you can just make sure your hands are firstly very clean and wet when you're holding your frog so you don't dehydrate him. But me personally, I prefer to use gloves. Make sure to use water conditioner in the water you're using for your frog as well, as tap water has chlorine in it, which will also kill your frog. You can buy water conditioner at any aquarium or pet store. Use that in any water you're going to have your frog touching. This goes for water that's not only in their water bowl or in the water reservoir if you're doing a paludarium, but also any water you're using to mist or spray down the enclosure. Make sure it's conditioned before you use it. Other than that, these guys like to climb. You'll notice my enclosure behind me here has both climbing vines and ledges. So they're kind of a big chunky frog. They don't really want thin spindly branches. They're not that dexterous. They want big fat branches they can quite easily sit on, or rocky ledges. Now you can look at buying these fake rocky ledges, maybe. I don't know where you'd buy them from. Some aquariums do sell fake rock backgrounds that have ledges already on them, or alternatively, you can just make your own ledges out of expanding foam. I made these ones behind me here, and pretty much I made everything here from scratch, including the vines and the ledges. I'll pop a link at the top of the screen if you want to see how I've done that. But yes, you can use ledges and branches for your frogs. They will definitely use them because these guys love being up high and they love sitting up off the ground. You can also use live plants with these frogs, as I've done behind me here. Or if you don't want to have that hassle of looking after live plants on top of looking after the frogs, you can always just go fake ones as well. Either is fine, but the frogs do appreciate the greenery and having that extra cover to hide in when they want to. Green tree frogs are actually pretty versatile frogs when it comes to temperature as well. While a lot of other more strictly tropical frogs need like very high humidity, high temperatures all the time, these guys are pretty versatile because they're found in many different places all over Australia, which vary in temperatures depending on where you look. They're found up north where it's much warmer, they're found down south where it's much cooler. So they're a pretty versatile frog with temperature and humidity. They can live in anything from 20 degrees right up to 30 degrees quite happily. They can also tolerate winter time. I'm in New South Wales, it gets kind of cold here in winter. Green tree frogs are native here. So they can tolerate the winter here without any assistance of like adding any extra heating equipment on the enclosure. So really, unless you're getting under 10 degrees Celsius in the winter, you don't really need to add any heating equipment on your frog. Look, when it gets into winter, they do get less active, and if it gets really cold, like maybe under 20 degrees, maybe around 15 degrees-ish, you might notice them becoming very inactive, and they might almost go into a semi-hibernatory sort of state where they're not fully hibernating, but they're not really eating much or doing much at all. And that's fine. They do that in the wild, but if you don't want that and you want them to remain active throughout winter, then yes, you can put some heating equipment on the tank. You don't necessarily have to. So if you want to heat their enclosure during winter, well, you can do a couple of things. You can get a big heat mat and stick it to the side or the back glass of the enclosure, and that will kind of just warm the air in the enclosure ever so slightly, not enough to be overly like dramatic or anything, but it'll just raise the ambient temperature by a few degrees. Enough to keep them active during winter. If you're keeping them in a paludarium style setup like I've got, where the whole bottom of the enclosure is aquatic essentially, you can put a fish tank heater in there during winter and set that temperature to about 26 to 28 degrees Celsius, and the warmth from the water will cause evaporation, and that evaporated water will help warm the enclosure a little bit too. Try not to use things like heat lamps, as this will be too hot and dry for your frog, and if the frog is sitting under the heat lamp for too long, it might actually burn and dry itself out. And this will also lower the humidity in the enclosure way too much for these guys. Saying that, they are pretty versatile with humidity as well. Anything from 30 to 50% humidity is perfectly fine for these, and that's perfectly achievable for most people. Just by having an enclosure with a large water reservoir like I've done here, this enclosure seems to maintain a humidity of around 40 to 50% on any given day, without me having to really do anything externally to adjust the humidity. It just seems to be consistent on its own. Even though green tree frogs are technically nocturnal, they do need UVB light and they do get UVB exposure in the wild. Not a lot of it, but oftentimes they will sleep kind of semi-exposed and just get maybe filtered or dappled light in the wild, as they don't always fully tuck themselves away when they're sleeping during the day. Sometimes they're kind of semi out in the open, they're just kind of tucked up in a little ball, pretending to be a leaf. But they are getting dappled or filtered sunlight sometimes. So they do need UVB light. A a 5.0 UVB tube, either a T8 or a T5 UVB tube is definitely recommended for these, and you want to run that for roughly 10 hours a day. Make sure to dust their food with calcium powder as well. Otherwise, there's no point in even giving them UVB if you're not giving them calcium along with UVB, because amphibians and reptiles use the vitamin D from UVB to metabolize calcium, which they get from their food. The frogs will also enjoy a spray down every now and again. So you get your spray bottle with some water conditioner, of course. Give the enclosure a good spray down. The frogs actually will absorb some of that new water that's come into contact with their body, and then they'll actually wee. I've noticed every time I spray my frogs, they immediately start weeing. They almost projectile wee the second they get sprayed with water. This is because frogs will often hold water in their body to keep themselves hydrated for as long as they can. When it's not raining, they kind of retain whatever water they have until it rains again. When it rains, the new water comes into contact with their skin, which then absorbs into their body. They then expel all the old water that they've been holding in their body and replace it with the new fresh water. So you want to spray them down a couple of times a week at least. You can do it daily, they'll absolutely love it, but at least 2 to 3 times a week, you want to give them a good spray down. Spraying the enclosure down can help with humidity as well, but like I was saying, it's not a big deal with these. They're pretty versatile with humidity. The other thing to think about when setting these guys up, depending on what style of enclosure you choose, if it's a paludarium, this probably doesn't apply to you so much, but if it's a more typical enclosure, if just a water bowl, you want to pick a substrate to go on the bottom of the enclosure as well. I found probably the better substrates to use for these would be either sphagnum moss or cocoa peat, but if I had to pick between the two, I'd probably choose sphagnum moss because cocoa peat's quite fine and it just gets stuck all over the frog every time they hop on the bottom. Doesn't really hurt them in any way, it's just your frog's constantly got soil stuck all over it, you know? So sphagnum moss is bigger and chunkier and heavier, and they don't really get it stuck all over their body in the same way. Sphagnum moss also has antifungal properties, so it's less likely to go moldy should your humidity be too high, or you don't have enough airflow or something, or you're overspraying the enclosure and there's too much moisture collecting on the bottom. At least with sphagnum moss, you have a much lower chance of a fungal problem. Now, green tree frogs are a very fun frog, and they're very, very hungry frogs. They have a crazy food drive and they almost always want to eat something. And this is part of their charm. They're not really afraid of people, and they almost associate you with food after a while. My frogs, I have 5 that I keep in this enclosure behind me here. And as soon as I open these doors to feed them, within a few minutes, they're all kind of lined up on these branches, kind of waiting for their food, because I actually feed them with tongs. I don't just throw a bunch of crickets in the enclosure. I absolutely hate doing that with anything I keep that eats crickets or insects in general. I hate just throwing them in the enclosure because this enclosure is kind of extravagant. There's plants, there's lots of little nooks and crannies that the frogs can't even access. Crickets just get into everything and they just, kind of never ever get eaten. Or they end up just dead in the water and I have to just end up pulling them out later and they're completely wasted. So I prefer to tong feed my frogs. Also because I can then regulate how much every frog is eating, I can make sure everyone gets the same amount of food. But because these frogs are so habituated to people, and frankly, green tree frogs as a whole generally aren't that scared of people after being in captivity for not that long, they'll quite happily just take food from the tongs. So they're going to be eating pretty much an insect diet. It'll have to be live insects for the most part. You can feed them crickets, you can feed them woodies, you can feed them mealworms and superworms. They'll eat anything that moves that'll fit in their mouth. You want to dust the prey items with a calcium powder supplement and a vitamin supplement, at least every other feeding if you can, and try to feed them at least 2 to 3 times a week. Younger green tree frogs, if you're, say, raising them from tadpoles and they're quite young still, you probably want to be feeding them more or less every day. But as they get bigger, you can drop them down to every second or even every third day. And you'll also find in winter, you maybe only have to feed them once or even twice a week, and that's it, because their metabolism has slowed down so much, they don't need as much food. How much do you feed each frog? Well, look, to be honest, that's just something you're going to have to use your own judgment on a little bit. But as a rough idea, I give mine maybe at this size, maybe 10 crickets, 12 crickets each roughly. I don't really keep a count because I got 5 frogs and I'm kind of going between with the tongs. I just roughly kind of give them around 10-ish crickets each, roughly. And you can kind of see when they've eaten enough. I mean, they'll still take it, but you can kind of get a rough idea of when they've had enough. But just remember, for the most part, they're sitting around not doing very much. So they're not exactly burning off calories quickly. So try not to overfeed them because they can get obese. You can feed them a pinky mouse every now and again, like a frozen thawed pinky. However, this is strictly something you do as a treat every now and again. It's not their staple diet because they'll end up overweight. It's a much more high fat content than crickets and wood roaches are. But let's say you've come home from work and you're tired and it's like a one-off thing. You don't want to be sitting in front of your frog enclosure, feeding crickets one by one by one. You just want to give it one thing to eat that'll, fill it up and then you can go to bed or whatever. Then yes, you can give it a pinky mouse if you just want a singular meal that'll fill up the frog in one go rather than sitting there feeding it one cricket after another. So a pinky mouse is good for that sort of situation, but I wouldn't feed it as its regular meal. And like with the crickets, dust it in calcium powder, because green tree frogs, believe it or not, can develop metabolic bone disease. I've seen it personally actually with magnificent tree frogs, which are essentially a green tree frog with spots. They're very, very similar. And thankfully I managed to fix them, but yeah, it was pretty bad for a while. They were essentially walking around on their knuckles and their head was down, couldn't really jump or anything. I had to keep them under really high intense UVB light and pump them full of calcium for weeks. They eventually came good again, but yes, frogs can get metabolic bone disease just like lizards can. Another thing that kind of throws people off and even worries some people when they see this with their frogs is green tree frogs, and all frogs for that matter, do actually shed their skin just like a snake or a lizard. The act of them doing so can be kind of concerning if you don't know what they're doing. Now, green tree frogs actually eat their shed skin kind of like a lot of gecko species do. And the way they do it, it looks like they're sick because they're essentially swallowing their skin through each corner of their mouth, and they're kind of in a sort of hunched over position, and they're kind of like, look like they're gagging. They're actually just trying to swallow their skin off their body. They're essentially just eating it off their body directly. So it's kind of sticking out of each corner of their mouth. But to someone who doesn't know what that is, it kind of looks like they've got like goo coming out of their mouth or like mucus coming out of their mouth, but it's actually just their like very thin, wet, kind of tissue papery skin going in to their mouth. They're just kind of sucking it in that way. But they look like they're sick when they're doing it, but I assure you that's normal. It's nothing to worry about. And lastly, with your green tree frogs, they're not a handling frog, even in spite of the fact that this guy's been sitting here quite nicely for this video. And, if they weren't a frog, if they were a reptile, they'd probably be a fantastic animal for handling because they are just so placid and they often will just sit and not jump away like a lot of other frogs will. But because they are a frog, it is best to not handle them unless you have to. If you're cleaning the enclosure and you need to move them from one place to another, fine. But still, put on some gloves or make sure your hands are wet and clean. Otherwise, they're strictly a display animal only. But honestly, as far as a display frog goes, they're pretty good. I mean, they're a nice, pretty color, they're decent sized, and they're not shy, they don't hide. If you have an enclosure with a few green tree frogs in it, you're gonna always see them. They don't hide that much. They're always sitting out where you can see them. And if you have food, they're quite interactive and they'll take food straight out of your hand. So if a chunky little green blob with big cute eyes that doesn't know when to stop eating is something you might want as a display animal, maybe the Australian green tree frog is for you. If you've enjoyed this video, guys, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. If you would like to buy me a coffee and support the channel, there's a link in the description to that as well. Until then, I'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.